Thank you, Jesse. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. I think this is maybe my fourth science forum that I've attended in the last 4 years, and I did want to compliment the partners and the Model Watershed. This is just an excellent forum for sharing information, bringing new information um, to bear, and for sharing. What I'm going to be doing today is presenting um, a habitat retrospective report that the ISRP completed and published last June. And it's a review and synthesis of progress and challenges in the Columbia River Basin Fish and Wildlife Program, habitat protection and restoration projects. This report was a collaborative effort, and there was actually 9 fairly significant contributors to the report. This particular presentation was developed it's not matching up quite right, but that's all right, by 5 individuals with particularly strong contributions from Kurt Fausch and Stan Gregory, a former ISRP chair. And it was developed and delivered originally to the Power Council at the end of the summer, and it was delivered by 5 individuals. We were unable to accommodate an online presentation. All of these individuals wanted to participate, but were unable to. So, I drew the straw, and I get to be the presenter. But there are some technical elements of this presentation that Kurt Fausch and Stan developed, and I'm going to be relying extensively on their notes when I get to some of those elements. So bear with me because I'll be doing some reading on some of the slides here. The ISRP has 3 levels of review responsibility. I think all of you are familiar with the project reviews that you've undergone in the council program. And then we review direct funded programs like the Lower Snake Comp Hatchery program, and we just finished the Steelhead review of the Lower Snake program in the Snake Basin. And then there's retrospective review of project results. And retrospective reviews are really a review of results of prior year's expenditures, but over multiple years. And it was a popular review approach for the ISRP, and there was actually 4 reviews published in the past, but the last one was in 2011, and there hasn't been one since. So this particular review follows on the 4 that were published in the past. And basically what the reviews are supposed to accomplish is identify measurable benefits to fish and wildlife from the program projects, provide information to improve program and project effectiveness and assess performance, and summarize major basin-wide programmatic issues that have been identified during project reviews, and provide, probably most importantly, recommendations. So why did we choose to do a habitat retrospective report now? Well, there's been 40 plus years of Fish and Wildlife Program habitat protection and restoration work, and a dramatic increase in scope and emphasis over time on natural processes, floodplains, riparian conditions, and complexity. In the 28 years of ISRP reviews, restoration approaches and RM&E are highlighted, and I'm sure you're all aware of this because you've probably seen it in your reviews, in programmatic issues and oftentimes in project conditions that we deliver to the proponents. 2022 marked the end of the 6th major review of Fish and Wildlife Program projects, actually starting another round of reviews beginning next year with a new and revised process that the council will be using, quite a bit more simplified. And I think they're going to start with the lands program. A similar review hasn't been conducted for well over a decade. And the Columbia Basin Tributary Habitat RM&E strategy, which was developed by co-managers and federal entities, basically was developed and adopted, and it's provided some new framework for evaluating restoration and protection. And so we felt like it was an important time to go ahead and do a retrospective review. The goal of the review was to inform decision makers, managers, and the general science community of advances and challenges in habitat restoration approaches for the Fish and Wildlife Program. Um, Specific objectives are to identify advancements and achievements in habitat protection and restoration planning, prioritization, implementation, and RM&E. Evidence for success, including identification of exemplary projects and elements and characteristics of exemplary projects, to identify current and emerging challenges, and then make recommendations to the council and to the proponents for improvements in program actions and approaches. Our approach, we reviewed and synthesized a number of documents. We examined guidance, approaches, findings, effectiveness, remaining challenges. There were over 360 references, as well as all of the program summaries and program and project proposals. We looked at the Habitat RM&E strategy, and then we built from past ISRP and ISAB reports. Our focus was on salmon and steelhead, and to some extent resident trout. But we did consider wildlife projects also, so there's a brief section in the report on wildlife projects. And the focus was on restoration types that targeted um, habitat and natural processes, in contrast to structural, although we do include both in the review. The report is somewhat organized around an adaptive management approach. Um, and there's an executive summary, a summary, plus the main body of the report that has quite a bit of technical material. There's an introduction, a review of planning and prioritization of methods of RM&E, a summary of intensively monitored watersheds, confounding factors, and exemplary projects. So those are the chapters, and I'll touch on most of those. This presentation will be sort of a high-level view of what's in the document, but we will get into some details, particularly in the planning and prioritization and the methods and RM&E sections. Early efforts in the Fish and Wildlife Program, I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been revisions and reiterations and adoption of new Fish and Wildlife Program uh, through amendment process since 1982, and they're actually in the process of revising the Fish and Wildlife Program right now. Early efforts focused on improving passage at the dams, building and initiating hatchery programs, and focusing on harvest. Of course, over time, the efforts expanded significantly with emphasis on tributary habitat protection and restoration, mostly for offsite mitigation because of the limitations in accomplishing what was needed just by focusing on passage, dams, hatcheries, and harvest. And there's been a major shift in emphasis to restoring ecological processes. The paradigm guiding restoration has shifted from restoring structure to natural processes. And although few of the program's habitat restoration projects meet the full description of process-based restoration, there's still a mix generally of structure and process-based. The proportion designed to restore impaired processes has increased quite dramatically since 2000 to emphasize focus on ecosystem function. I'm going to move into now discussion of planning and prioritization in terms of the improvements. The program's restoration efforts have evolved, expanded, and improved. There's been increased recognition of the importance of restoring natural processes, floodplains, riparian conditions, and habitat complexity. And as important, there's been many new approaches and technologies that have really allowed improvement of planning, design, implementation, effectiveness, and RM&E. When you look at LiDAR, drone imagery, GIS, pit tags, all kinds of new technology that really provides a vast amount of information that wasn't available in the early parts of the Fish and Wildlife program. In terms of the improvements in planning and prioritization, there's been increasing and effective use of habitat assessments and habitat and life cycle models, more rigorous analysis of limiting factors and density dependence, use of indigenous knowledge. We just heard a wonderful presentation about the value of that and the concepts embedded in it. And an example here is the first foods planning that's done by the framework by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. I mentioned that strategic guidance has expanded and improved, and we identify and describe a, a number of really valuable and well-described strategic guidance from documents, including the Ronde Atlas, the Upper Columbia River Biological Strategy to Protect and Restore Salmonid Habitat, the First Foods Framework from Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Oregon Conservation and Recovery Plan for Mid-Columbia River Steelhead, and the Lower Columbia River Estuary Partnership. Some common elements of the strategic guidance include pretty much all of these have protect and restore the highest quality habitat that supports core production, primary life history types, and important migratory habitats. Base planning on a sound understanding of ecological processes and system properties. Maintain and restore critical ecological and evolutionary processes. Target key limiting factors that most affect population productivity, spatial structure, and diversity. The key elements for evaluating viability under ESA. Manage in an adaptive manner that's minimally intrusive and based on sound M&E results. What you'll see in all of the chapters are key findings and recommendations, and I'll kind of highlight some of the recommendations as I move through these sections. So related to planning recommendations, um, continue to expand the use of strategic guidance. And for those programs or projects that don't have a strategic guidance that they're able to use, we suggest they borrow strategic guidance from a number of the ones that are available that I identified earlier. Continue to support the analysis and the use of limiting factors, density dependence, life history knowledge, and including life cycle modeling. And explore the potential application of habitat and life cycle models for restoration plannings for projects that don't have those tools right now. And there are actually a lot of projects that don't fall under big umbrella programs like the Grande Watershed, the collaboration that goes on here, and all of the entities that are involved. And we think it might be valuable to extend some of the things that are learned through these kind of programs to those programs that don't have those tools. Incorporate process-based restoration, the assessments necessary to support it in planning and prioritization, and determine where watershed level assessment and coordination approaches are effectively guiding restoration, and then develop additional subbasins that can replicate those kinds of effectiveness. For example, the Ronde Basin is a wonderful example of a pretty effective program compared to many others that don't have all the assets here. So what can be borrowed from what's learned in the Ronde and shared elsewhere? we think is a valuable step forward. So I'm going to move into methods. Um, a key goal of our report was to review the effectiveness of habitat restoration methods, which we grouped into 8 categories. Effectiveness can be measured at a broad range of scales from reaches to watersheds, and I'll discuss that fairly extensively in a few slides ahead. Of course, everybody knows restoration can attempt to restore physical and ecological processes that sustain viability of natural fish populations, or it can be more engineered based to attempt to create channels with desirable characteristics like large wood. Of course, there's increasing emphasis on projects that restore both processes and structure, but the large-scale efforts needed to implement those kind of projects are really quite challenging um, at the watershed scale or the population scale. The best examples that we identified in our review for subbasin or population level restoration are those like the Grand Ronde, uh, Catherine Creek, Upper Columbia, and the Lower Columbia River estuary. Most projects are focused on anadromous fish, so we asked whether habitat restoration was fundamentally different for resident fish such as bull trout and cutthroat trout. And you'll see in the report that we found an excellent example, excuse me, of watershed restoration in the Blackfoot River Basin in Montana, where barrier removal, adding large wood, and riparian plantings paired with significant improvement in land use allowed resident trout abundance to increase markedly. So really quite successful example. So I'm gonna um, this is sort of a template slide just to introduce the concept, and then the next 2 slides I'll bring in some specifics related to barriers and floodplains. So evidence for effectiveness of habitat restoration varies depending on the spatial extent and the duration of the studies. So on the x-axis is spatial extent, and on the y-axis is time. And for example, some study effects of restoration after a few years only conducted in reaches of 100 yards, which is um, an example of that is the AEM, or at least elements of the AEM. And these types of evaluations can yield clear results, but conclusions are typically limited to short reaches and time spans, and it might be difficult to make inference to higher level watershed or population scale conclusions. Other studies of um, include the effect of restoration in whole watersheds over generations of fish, and they're much more challenging to conduct, and results are typically available only after decades of study. But these types of studies provide much more relevant information for managers, and examples of those are the numerous intensively monitored watershed programs, or I would call it the Grand Ronde Collaborative. I always looked at the Grand Ronde Basin as an IMW even before they had IMWs. And to be honest with you, a lot of the work that goes on in the Grand Ronde Basin mirrors or even exceeds some of the things that are going on in some of the intensively monitored watersheds. So I'm going to present 2 examples for 2 of the 8 methods reviewed, and this is where I am going to have to rely on the notes of Kurt Fausch because these are concepts that he developed to include in the report and in this presentation. So I'll start with barrier removal. There are tens of thousands of barriers in the Columbia River Basin that block access to habitat upstream, both for adults and juveniles. And barrier removal is among one of the most common restoration treatments. The Upper Columbia Salmon River Recovery Board, prior to 2012, removed 93 barriers and opened up 282 miles of blocked habitat. So it just gives you sort of a feel for how extensive, even just in the Upper Columbia, that type of action is. Clark et al., which is 2020, and it's from the AEM project, measured fish above and below 32 sites where barriers had been removed a few years earlier, and they found no difference in densities of juvenile steelhead and all anatomous salmonids between below and above. So they infer that rapid colonization had been successful in the areas that had been opened up by the barrier removal. Shelgren and Dunham in 2015 publication evaluated 162 road crossings throughout 80 coastal watersheds of the Siuslaw and found that replacing culverts to U.S. Forest Service design standards increased fish access by 40 times. However, location in the watershed and conditions above the barrier were really important because less than 10% of the 116 miles of habitat opened up were colonized because most of the habitat was too steep and narrow and it had very low suitability. So that needs to always be obviously a concern when you're opening up habitat with barriers. Bilby et al., who did an extensive review of IMWs, concluded that most IMWs have not made detailed analyses of the data that they have, but conducted simple tallies that showed 10 of the IMWs where barriers were removed, fish colonized upstream in 9 of them, and they measured increased juvenile or smolt density, survival, or growth in 8 of 10. And the reason that the bubble is a little bit lighter in that one is because the evidence isn't quite as strong as it was in the Clark et al. Paper. Overall, evidence over a range of scales shows that barrier removal is one of the most common and successful restoration actions. Oh, I thought we had the floodplain one, but we got the large wood. So now I'm going to go through a similar discussion with this same graphic. So adding large wood that creates pools and complex habitat has been used in the Columbia River Basin since the very initiation of the Fish and Wildlife Program. For example, in the upper Columbia River, wood additions made up 1/5 of the projects, and there's been over 500 structures that were added to create pools in 22 miles of stream. Again, looking at the AEM, Clark et al. Analyzed 29 projects completed 5 or 6 years earlier. On average, they found they increased pools and habitat complexity by 20 to 40%, doubled or nearly tripled the counts of juvenile Chinook, coho, and steelhead. Increasing wetted wood by 10 times is predicted to increase juvenile Chinook by threefold. And then Bilby et al., large wood or beaver dam analogs were installed in 12 of the 13 IMWs they reviewed, and tallies showed increased habitat complexity in 8 of 12, positive responses of juvenile or adult fish in 10 of 12, and large wood or BDA additions were typically only one of the several habitat restoration treatments, so there was other actions that were taken. In Polivka et al., 2015, which is an intermediate scale between the reach and the watershed, juveniles colonized engineered log jams installed in 300 to 500 meter segments of the Eniat River, which is an IMW, and it increased densities of Chinook by 3 to 13 fold and steelhead by 2 to 7 fold compared to adjacent pools that were not restored. There was no change in densities in the unrestored pools nearby compared to those in segments farther away, indicating that colonization of the ELJs had not simply concentrated fish and reduced density elsewhere, as some have claimed or often assumed, but actually increased abundance. So very effective, not just displacing fish, but increasing capacity. So I'm just checking to make sure my Mine doesn't look quite the same as that. Anyway, so this is a summary that Dr. Fausch put together of methods, and it includes the method, the effect, the response time, and key limitations. So, effect, a red plus, are methods with strong likelihood of positive benefits for anadromous salmonids. Those in parentheses have variable or uncertain effects, but clearly positive effects. Response time for those in bold blue for at least some projects are likely to achieve outcomes in a short time frame. That's 5 to 10 years. For other methods, the response times are uncertain and usually longer. Overall, we concluded that removing barriers and reconnecting side channels in floodplains, including estuaries, are most likely to have positive effects for anadromous salmonids. There's reasonable evidence across scales to assess effects of many restoration methods, actually all of these, but still substantial uncertainty about the time required for restoration, particularly for riparian zones, floodplains, and cold water refugia. Recommendation methods. Protection is critical and should always be considered in tandem with restoration. Process-based restoration should be emphasized over structural-based. Of the 8 methods that we looked at, removing barriers and reconnecting side channels in floodplains have strong likelihood of positive benefits. Barrier removal, flow enhancement, wood additions are likely to achieve results in a short time frame, 5 to 10 years. Restoration of riparian forests and floodplain function have uncertain timeframes for effectiveness and obviously are likely to be much longer. We support continuation of long-term projects like the IMWs and what I call the Grand Ronde Sub-Basin Collaborative Efforts, which is what all you do to answer key current and future questions. And then we think it's important to develop a coordinated study to monitor and evaluate effectiveness of floodplain reconnection, riparian and meadow restoration, and creation of cold water refugia. Now I'm going to move into research monitoring and evaluation, and this is another section that I'm going to rely on significant notes from Dr. Fausch. So we reviewed the Columbia Basin tributary habitat RMNE strategy, and we believe it describes a consistent and logical approach to assessing physical and biological benefits of restoration actions. It's built around 5 key management questions, which are really valuable to address 3 goals of project implementation and effectiveness. We found much to like about this broad, collaborative, and inclusive approach, and it fits very well with an adaptive management process. The strategy emphasizes project and reach level monitoring, but it provides limited guidance on some of the challenging problems of scaling up to watersheds or population scale. There's not a lot of good guidance on approaches to analysis of the data that's recommended to be collected, and there isn't a clear description of what the implementation approach is for the strategy. And lastly, there's no design or plan that we're aware of to evaluate the effectiveness of implementation of the strategy. So those are some things that we're recommending could be improved with the strategy. The ISRP considered study design at several different stages, from planning the study scale and metrics to addressing desired levels of confidence versus relevance. A key is to test alternative sampling designs with pilot or simulated data to ensure results can evaluate the desired questions that you're seeking to answer. In many cases, including from various IMWs, data had been collected before studies were designed, so optimal designs are not really possible after you've already started implementation in some cases. Baki designs can be powerful ways to assess the effectiveness, but there's many challenges and a lot of variations in how they're applied. In large-scale IMWs or similar large-scale studies like what's going on in the Grand Ronde fires, floods, and droughts can coincide with treatments, and they prevent separating the effects. So if you have large fires, droughts, so on, it makes it difficult to uh, parse out the effects of the treatments versus the landscape changes. A staircase Baki design where treatments are staggered in a different subwatersheds can buffer to some extent against these large-scale effects. Synthesizing information across multiple studies. So scale studies like IMWs can provide results that are highly relevant for managers, but the results have not been analyzed, especially across multiple studies. So there hasn't really been an effort to take data and information across all these IMWs and try to integrate it into a combined analysis. We looked at options based on new statistical methods that can evaluate information collected in different years for different durations and address high year-to-year variation in habitat conditions and population performance. And we found an example, and it's an analysis of Chinook supplementation in the Snake River Basin, where there's 12 supplemented populations for 11 to 23 years versus 10 that were not supplemented. And 6 of the 12 not supplemented, in 6 of the 12 supplemented populations, they weren't all supplemented every year. So despite high variation, um, which in most years was twice that natural variation, twice that of owing to supplementation, they found that the long-term trends were a decline and then an increase, but the average increase in spawner abundance was only 3.3%. In and we believe this type of approach might be useful for examining some of the habitat restoration response in the IMWs that have these long-term data sets. There's a section in the document on confounding factors, and I won't go into it in great detail. It includes climate change, landscape change, ocean conditions, non-native species, predation, hatchery fish, supplementation, dams, density dependence, water quality, logistical factors, and then, of course, you have interactions between many of these factors. Um, One of the recommendations is looking ahead to develop tools to try to forecast future conditions. Here's an example of one of the things we identified as a confounding factor, which everybody's aware of, which is variable ocean conditions. Um, Along with climate change, this might be one of the most challenging factors to deal with is variable ocean conditions, including PDO, El Nino, upwelling, climate change variation such as the blob, general warming of the ocean. And as you were all aware, a high proportion of lifetime mortality of salmon occurs in the ocean. So a lot of people throw up their hands and say, well, since so many fish are dying in the ocean, you know, what's the value of restoring and protecting some of these critical freshwater habitats for production of anadromous salmonids? But in the long run, producing more smolts in good condition results in more salmon surviving to adulthood. Survival attributes like size at migration, time of migration are directly affected by freshwater conditions, and they affect survival at sea. And there's good evidence for that. And high quality habitat, especially critical when you go to these low periods of survival in the ocean. Um, because that's what provides you some level of resilience even under terrible conditions in the ocean. Spawning escapements or other adult metrics can often be a poor measure of success when they're looked at in isolation, especially if you're trying to use adult returns for smaller scale restoration projects. But of course, that watershed and IMW scales, adult returns, adult productivity, adult life history, those can be very useful and important metrics. So next, I'm going to move to exemplary projects. So in the report, we identify a number of exemplary projects for anadromous fish, as well as resident fish and wildlife. Um, Plus, we identify key elements and characteristics of exemplary projects. And exemplary projects are those that are guided by sound strategies, clear goals, smart objectives, and quantitative desired outcomes. They address key limiting factors and current and emerging threats. They illustrate strong collaboration and partnerships with effective information learning. And they have effective integration of their restoration actions and their RM&E. So they're coupled pretty well. So you're addressing the key questions that need to be addressed. Here's a list of the exemplary projects that we identified, and these come from the last anadromous hatchery and habitat review that the ISRP did. The Columbia River Land Trust Estuary Restoration Project, Wind River Watershed Restoration Project, which is U.S. Forest Service, WDFW, and the U.S. Geological Survey and Underwood Conservation District. Grande Watershed Restoration Project, which is a Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation of Oregon. Umatilla Anadromous Fish Habitat Project, which is CTOI project. And then evaluating salmonid and stream ecosystem response to conservation measures and stressors, which is a Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission project, and actually is a Grand Ronde Basin focused project. So I'm going to wrap this up here pretty quickly. But what I did, and this is not a full ISRP perspective. I kind of took everything that I just presented and I sort of looked at through a lens at the Grand Ronde collaborative restoration efforts, which I'm calling the model watershed, all the partners, all the work that goes on. And I kind of did an assessment of where you stand, I guess. And I would say it's probably quite biased because much of the work that continues to be ongoing is stuff that I was involved with a long time ago. So it may not be totally unbiased. But anyway, as far as planning and prioritization, I think this collaboration has solid strategic guidance foundation. There's consideration of life history, density dependence, limiting factors, viability analysis, and in looking at proposed actions. There's multiple watershed assessments that are used to provide information to look at what needs to be done. Uh, the program uses viability assessments, gaps, and multiple life cycle models, and its highly collaborative, multidisciplinary planning approach uses RM&E information integrated with other information planning and the Atlas approach. And you do things like this. You have these meetings that are just really valuable for sharing. And there's lots of programs that don't don't do this and don't have these opportunities or take these opportunities. When we look at implementation methods, there's a balanced emphasis on process-based and structural restoration. There's large-scale projects, and I think all of you would recognize and agree as time has gone on, this magnitude of the size of the projects has really increased over time, and the focus is on floodplain and riparian restoration and restoring complexity. Uh, there's multi-species approaches. I think it was year before last we heard about mussels that were encountered in the approach of implementing some restoration projects, and some very quick ad hoc approaches taken to deal with those mussel beds and not destroy them, which I think shows that it's a multi-species approach as well as multiple fish species. It applies current state of the science in all phases of restoration. Generally, there's very good landowner relationships and cooperation, um, and the efforts are diversified on public and private lands. And then there's the RM&E component, and this I think is a very strong area that includes fish in, fish out, abundance, productivity, spatial structure, diversity, PHOS, supplementation evaluation. You have current and ongoing habitat assessments to update the data sets and the condition assessments. There's life history assessments and multiple life cycle models to identify key habitats, key life histories, key limiting factors, and it's highly collaborative. Uh, Other elements that I think are strong points is a very well defined and sound adaptive management approach. There's good integration of RM&E with implementation, and there's strong publication record and history of information sharing. So I'm going to wrap this up with some conclusions and then some acknowledgments. So overall, we've seen very significant improvement over 40 plus years of in the Fish and Wildlife Program habitat protection and restoration work. Planning, prioritization, and implementation methods of projects and actions have dramatically been improved. Restoration methods have improved and have used the monitoring information to make those improvements. And of course, there's much greater focus on process-based approaches. RM&E challenges remain despite significant program efforts. There's the Columbia Basin Tributary Habitat RM&E strategy, which we believe is promising if it's implemented, and they address some of the weaknesses of the data analysis, data sharing, and those kind of things, and creating the ability to scale up the outcomes of habitat restoration to the Columbia River Basin, to synthesize information across studies, especially for the IMWs. Just to provide some acknowledgments, we had a lot of review and support from the council staff. We had presentations from Bonneville Power that helped us a lot in our review, including Jody Landau, Sean Welch, and Russell Scranton, and then a number of other people providing information and photos, and I won't go through all of those. But at this time, I'll go ahead and take questions.
We got to talk into the mic so the recording gets it.
Thanks, Rich. That was a great overview, and I've read the reports. Very nice synthesis and recommendations. One of the outcomes of this meeting, or I think on the next day, is adaptive management recommendations coming out of this conference. And so I'm just wondering, you had a lot of complimentary things to say about the Grand Ronde and everything that seems to be doing well based on your review. Are there any things that you think need to be considered for refining the program based on what you've learned with this?
Phil, I'd like to take a little time to think about that, and I might be a little behind related to the status of some of the actions in the RM&E and what isn't being done that was being done in the past. So it's a little difficult for me to answer that question right now, but I'll do some thinking about it, and maybe I can get back to the group with some thoughts on that. What I did for this sort of synthesis of strong points was look through the report and then look at just my personal perspective of what was going on in the basin. I may have missed the mark in a few spots, but anyway, I did not look for limitations or weaknesses. And I apologize for that.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that presentation. But so one of the things that I really struggle with a lot, and I think maybe you addressed it a little bit in your presentation, kind of peripherally, but is like the compounding factors, and it goes to the ecosystem process and the protection of habitat is, I'll just give an example. We were on Lapway Creek. We did this great project, removed a barrier, planted a bunch of trees and stuff. And then a year later, a new lander moves in upstream, puts in a bridge across the creek, very undersized, cuts down a bunch of cottonwoods. And it's just like, oh my God. So taking that two steps forward, one step back kind of a deal, and having those things that are in place to protect uh, what we're restoring, but then also even beyond that. I think of things like the forest plan revision. So the Blue Mountain Forest Plan revisions going on right now. We just got done with the Nez Clearwater. We focused to put a ton of time into those because those are the headwater streams of all these rivers. And, you got to look at the landscape, ridge top to ridge top, what's going on, and trying to put everything that we can or push in those forest plan revisions to get the protections to protect water quality and all those different things that are out there. I think of the mining right now, like in Idaho, holy cow, the Stibnite mine. I mean, they're starting to go big time on it right now. There's all kinds of mining exploration out there going on, suction dredging. The state of Idaho is trying to increase the number of suction dredgers on the South Fork Clearwater. All of those sorts of things. If we don't have from the county to the tribal to the state to the federal protections in place, a lot of times I feel like we're kind of chasing our tail sometimes. So I was wondering if you guys ever looked at that, or if you'd speak to that a little bit.
We do address the essential need and nature of um, trying to limit the rate of degradation, or at least to make sure that the rate of degradation is not outpacing the rate of restoration. And the kind of things that you're talking about are political and legislative things. And there has been and was a lot of progress made in some states in some of those areas when recovery plans were done. Um, and there is, and really that's where you have to get some of those higher level things done. There is a considerable emphasis right now on purchasing and acquiring large tracts of land and water, which is probably one of the most critical paths forward if you really want to have control and maintain protection in critical habitats for recovery. And I also think you got to be vigilant and not get disappointed when you work really hard on restoring tributary habitat and you don't necessarily see these immediate responses in productivity, viability, or expansion of range of spawners or natural origin fish abundance because of those confounding factors. Just because you're not seeing a very quick response in productivity or moving your population to its minimum viability threshold quickly doesn't mean you're not doing good things for the populations. And I think you really have to keep that in mind because it's the full life cycle of salmon encounters every bad thing humans can throw at it, right? Going to the ocean, in the ocean because of climate change, migratory conditions coming up the river. Um, and so you're battling all those things, not just what's going on in tributary habitat. And I think you have to keep that in mind. But I also think it's really important to have quantitative tools to help you understand that, like the life cycle models. And you have a couple in the Grand Ronde. Cryptic has one, and NOAA ODFW has one. And they really help you understand what the value is of the habitat restoration work that you're doing.
Rich, you just talked about the need to protect habitat and in the key findings within this review. The first word after the first bullet was protect. Um, Historically, or at least in the somewhat recent past, the state of Oregon has, in comparison to say neighboring states, has drastically underfunded the word protect. Does the ISRP have any ability to communicate and work with the state of Oregon to provide additional funding to help push that word protect forward and work on protecting those large tracts of land that you just talked about?
Um, the ISRP is an independent science panel that doesn't engage in um, state policy level decisions or necessarily even federal policy level decisions. What we try to do is provide the information that can be used by the people that have the ability to influence those decisions. Um, and so our desire is always to produce these retrospective reports and have the individuals take these recommendations, bring them into their policy forums to help influence the decisions that are going to be made. And I just want to clarify one thing. The panel members that I showed, and even myself, I went off the ISRP uh, on October 1st. So that reflects what the status was at the time that we produced this report. A number of the people on the panel are actually off now, and they're trying to they're in the process of sort of re- refilling a number of those positions.
Thanks, Rich, for the presentation. I agree with all the praise that you're giving to the Ronde collaborative research up here, and I'm wondering if the ISRP or you make any recommendations on how those good lessons in the process that was built here can be brought to other basins. And surely there's other things from other basins we could learn, but how do you recommend that information exchange happens between watersheds?
Um, I think it's going to have to come at a fairly high level, a directive from a fairly high level, like the council and Bonneville Power, um, providing some guidance and direction that looking at what we recommend and saying, yeah, in order to achieve these recommendations and the benefits that they'll provide, we have to start asking the people we're funding to do these things. Um, as far as the actual form or approach, of course, publications are great, but a lot of times the peer review publications can't get the big enough broad picture to deliver an exchange between groups. Um, and maybe it starts with just one individual from each of these exemplary programs that we identified, forming a team and then starting to talk about how can we help some of these other places or even help each other with what we're learning. Because when you do look at the Upper Columbia, the Yakima, the Upper Grand Ronde, um, and the estuary, there's some powerful knowledge and approaches and they all call things a little different, but when you really look at it, they're really making a lot of the decisions and the determination of where to focus and how to focus their efforts very similarly. So maybe that would be one first step. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the new thing you guys are going to get going at OSU might be able to build that in as something to move forward with.